It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. As reflected in the title of her talk, her work is at the intersection of air pollution, environmental change, and community-based participatory research. She graduated from Wofford College in South Carolina with degrees in biology and Spanish. She went on to work in Ken Pinkerton's lab, many of you know Ken, working on translation first from animal models around toxicology, especially around particulate matter. But then her work moved into the community a bit in Imperial Valley around the Salton Sea. There are issues with environmental change and drying up of the sea and contaminated particulate matter exposures down there. And that interest in the interface between community and environment and public health led her then to her present postdoc work at the University of Washington, where she's working at the Agricultural Health and Safety, or Safety and Health, Regional, what's it? Panache. Yeah. Where she's working with Native American communities, primarily in northern Washington state, on climate change, wildfire smoke exposures, and public health, and looking at risk communication and protecting, especially children from exposure to wildfire smoke in schools, using community-based participatory research or community action research with youth. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our Savannah Devlin.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I am Savannah Devlin. Today I'm going to be talking about pretty much everything that Rob just said here, but diving into a little bit more details of kind of my path from toxicology, exposure, and community-based participatory research. So just to give you kind of an outline of what I'll be talking through today, I'll first give just a little mini background of how I got interested in environmental health science, of my academic career and trajectory. I'll talk about my first project, which is the project that was mentioned in Imperial Valley at the very base of California, which was kind of my first intersection between toxicology and community-based participatory research, which I'll be calling CBPR for the rest of the time. I'm going to talk about this gap that became kind of apparent to me through this first project of this dogma of moving from data to knowledge to action that we hear a lot about in environmental science, and where we can kind of go from there. I'll talk about the project, which is my current project now, which is an intersection of CBPR and implementation science. And then the third project was actually a future project, which is a combination of exposure, youth participatory action research, or YPAR, and implementation science. And then I'll kind of finish up by talking about an interdisciplinary approach to future research. So my background was already kind of covered, but I started at Wofford College in South Carolina. It's a tiny little liberal arts school of 1,400 students. I majored in biology and Spanish. Biology was pretty much as specific as you could go in a very small school like that. Really thought I was going to go to medical school, and then did a summer internship at Mississippi State, where it was a research experience for undergraduates, which is an NSF-funded thing, and I studied equine asthma, which I'll talk a little bit more about. I did my Ph.D. at UC Davis. My Ph.D. is actually in physiology, but I moved more into the environmental tox through my dissertation project, and now I am a postdoc at the University of Washington. So, as I mentioned, I did a summer internship at Mississippi State, and it was a computational internship actually, and I was looking at the genome of horses that have equine asthma, which who knew that horses have asthma, right? I didn't know before then. This is my husband's horse. Her name's Oakley. She lives in Colorado, so she does not have asthma. She's not exposed to the environmental pollutants that are in the southeast of the United States, which is what triggers equine asthma. It's also called pasture heaves in certain parts of the country. This was really the first time that I was introduced to thinking about how the environment impacts our health. As I said, with biology, I was thinking much bigger, or thinking really, really small mechanistically. And so when I started learning about equine asthma, I started thinking, okay, what are some other things in the environment, not just allergens, but other things in the environment that can impact people too. So I moved from horses into human respiratory health, and my younger brother has asthma, and so I kind of latched onto that there and thinking about the mechanisms of asthma. I was very interested in mechanistic disease. And so I joined when I was looking at graduate schools, I was looking for something where I could kind of follow the pathways of diseases. So my graduate group was molecular, cellular, and integrative physiology, very mechanistic. And then I joined a lab that does air pollution research that looks at particulate matter across the state of California and around the world. And so I kind of had this connection between how does air pollution and the environment affect the respiratory system, which is where I really started in environmental health. So, as I mentioned, my Ph.D. is in physiology. I started way at the far end of this spectrum. If we think about environmental health science, and obviously there's lots of other disciplines that fit in here, but the three kind of areas that I have spanned across, which I'll talk about my journey from left to right here, I started way in toxicology, which was physiology at the time. So, my first project was the first time that I integrated toxicology and CVPR, which was an air quality project in Imperial Valley, California. Imperial Valley is at the very bottom of California. It's about 3 hours to the east of San Diego. So I did my PhD in Northern California at UC Davis, about a 10-hour drive. So California is very large when you're thinking about the East Coast states, right? California fits a lot of those East Coast states in there. So I would fly down to San Diego and then drive out to Imperial Valley. Imperial, as you can see here, is right at the border of Mexico. And so down as far as you can go. As far as sources of pollution in Imperial Valley, there's pretty much every single source that you can think of. As I mentioned, it's right at the border. Mexicali has over 1 million people. It's the second largest border crossing in the state of California. Lots of idling cars, lots of industrial pollutants that are not regulated in the same way in Mexico as they are in the United States. And so pollutants coming up across the border. Desert dust, it's an incredibly hot and getting hotter region, which impacts air pollution and what is blown up into the respirable air. The Salton Sea, which I'll circle back to. Agriculture itself, lots of pesticides, agricultural pollutants, feedlots. So this is a picture of one of the feedlots in Imperial Valley. There's 5 feedlots of this size in Imperial that have over 1 million head of cattle. It's a huge industry down there. And then industry itself, there's a meat packing plant and a sugar refinery. If y'all can think of other sources of pollution, let me know, but they pretty much have them all. The Salton Sea is a lake that is California's largest lake, actually. It was originally created as an offshoot of the Colorado River. They rerouted the Colorado River in 1905 in order to irrigate the valley and ended up flooding it instead. And over the next 100 years, they moved away all fresh water, and so the only inflow that's going into the lake now is industrial and agricultural runoff water. So you have this polluted lake that is seeping into a polluted lake bed. Because there's no real inflow anymore, it's shrinking. And so this exposed lake bed is now being blown around to the surrounding communities. And so clearly there's a lot of pollution here already, even without the Salton Sea, and then there's this extra problem that is just getting worse. So, this project started before I joined Dr. Pinkerton's lab as a CVPR project. This community-based organization, Comité Cívico del Valle, actually reached out to UC Davis and asked, hey, is there anyone there that can look at this potential connection that we have in Imperial between very high levels of air pollution and also really high levels of childhood asthma. Imperial Valley has the second highest or third highest rate of childhood asthma in the state of California, which California itself already has really high levels of childhood asthma. And so there's this growing concern in the community that there's something in the air that is leading to this. And so Dr. Pinkerton was open and excited to do this project, but he hadn't really done a full CVPR project before, and neither had I. Remember, I'm far at this end of toxicology spectrum, but I joined the lab, was excited about this potential project, and kind of jumped in right from the very beginning. The first time we interacted with CCV, after we had written the grant, so Dr. Pinkerton wrote the grant, and then I jumped in and basically took over from the beginning of my PhD. And so I went down to Imperial and had some admittedly kind of confusing conversations at the beginning. As a toxicologist, you don't know exactly what to ask of the community, what they're looking for. But we worked together with CCV, and then we ended up forming a community advisory board with the help of CCV to understand, okay, what is it that you really want to know? And while we had known about many of these sources of pollution, we didn't know about all of them. And so the first kind of step is we made this map of, okay, where are all the sources of pollution and what are you really most concerned about? And they were by far most concerned about the Salton Sea. And so we placed a sampling unit where that star is in Calipatria, north of the valley, which there's really nothing in between where that town of Calipat and the Salton Sea is. And so we tried to get as close to as possible to the lake bed of the Salton Sea, and we're collecting particulate matter samples from there for the course of a year. So this project started as a community-based participatory research project. This is half of the CBPR definition that comes from kind of an old paper, but a landmark paper in the CBPR field. So community-based participatory research is a partnership approach to research, which this project really started as that. One of my favorite parts about the partnership was this relationship that we had with the high school. So Calipatria High School is where we ended up parking our sampling unit, and there was an AP biology teacher who happened to be a UC Davis alum, and she was very excited to work with us from UC Davis. And so we engaged with her biology students. I wrote and was funded for 2 summers a grant to bring up students from Calipat up to UC Davis and have them work in the lab with me. They lived on campus, kind of got the campus experience, and then were able to do tox methods with samples that we collected from their hometown, which was really, really cool. So we did that for 2 summers with 15 different students. 2 of those students are now undergraduates at UC Davis. 6 of those other students are in environmental health science projects in different colleges around the country. Most of them had never left Imperial Valley before, so it was a pretty exciting project for both them and for me. I learned a lot from them, and that's what really got me excited about youth participatory action research, which I will talk a little bit more about later. So, as I said, kind of started far along this toxicology side, and this project really started to kind of scooch me more towards CBPR. So the question of the community was, is there a connection between Imperial Valley PM and the high levels of childhood asthma in the region? As toxicologists, we took that question and turned it into, does ambient PM from Imperial Valley lead to a significant biological response when exposed in vitro and in vivo models with and without the presence of an allergen? So we kind of turned it into, okay, what can we really learn from this? And with the conversations with community members, we had to really kind of set a border around, even if you are seeing other health effects, which are completely valid, we're going to concentrate on asthma, right? I'm not a neurotoxicologist. We can talk about that later, but this project is specifically going to focus on the respiratory effects. So I'm not going to dive very deep in here, but I want to give you a little bit of tox and some pathology things. So these are a smidgen of the results from this study. We segregated our different PM samples into size fractions. And so the different colors here, which realizing there's not a key on the top graph, sorry about that. To the far right, so that dark gray border is PM10, and then as it gets lighter, it's PM2.5 and ultrafine PM. And so this was from an in vivo exposure of mice treated without an allergen. So we treated over the course of 2 weeks with pollutant samples, with PM samples. And then we took lung sections and stained. This is just an H&E stain, and did scoring of the inflammation in the lung tissue, which I'm sure some of you all have done before. We found that mice treated with PM10 had way higher inflammatory scores than mice treated with this 2 smaller size fractions. We also did pulmonary function testing, which is what this graph on the bottom part shows. And in pulmonary function testing, we saw that the respiratory resistance was increased the most if they were exposed to PM2.5. So what we saw was that each different measure that we had, this is 2 of probably 12 different measures that we took just in our in vivo models, did in vitro as well. Each different measure had a different size of PM that kind of was flagged as having the most response. But if you think about that, if you're a human living in Imperial Valley, you're going to be exposed to all of the size fractions, right? It's a mixture of everything. So this work resulted in 2 papers. One was just submitted, so I gave you a screenshot of that part. One in Atmospheric Environment, which was published in 2020, and then hopefully this one in PHP in the next couple months, we'll see. So a couple conclusions from this study is that PM from Imperial Valley does have the potential to advance or to invoke a biological response, both in vitro and in vivo. Repeated exposure to specifically coarse PM, so PM10, consistently provoked an inflammatory response. And then PM from Imperial Valley leads to an enhanced asthmatic symptoms in an in vivo model, so when there was an allergen there as well. We also had one paper come out of this that was was talking specifically about the community-based participatory research aspect of this. So this paper was published by our Community Engagement Core at UC Davis, and it was 3 case studies comparing different interactions with community between academia and community partnerships. And our partnership with CCV was the 3rd case study in that. So part of the problem with this, so this is my whole dissertation project, was thinking about what's happening in Imperial Valley. And we got to these conclusions. Yes, the particulate matter that we collected does invoke an asthmatic response in a model. There's differences between size fractions. We shared this with the community. We had a wonderful session where the high school students and I went back down to the community, brought the community advisory board together. But that's really all that happened, right? We shared the results and then I graduated and we moved on. And so this is where I think a lot of research kind of stops. Not all, by any means, but it's something that I saw quite a few times in my PhD and got me kind of asking where do we go from here? So as I mentioned, this is the first half of this CVPR definition. Second part, if you're doing a true CVPR project, is that you need to integrate the knowledge gained with action to improve the health and well-being of community members. So this last little circle I've uncovered, you need to translate data into interventions and our policy, which in that original grant that we wrote with CCV, there was a one-liner about integrating it into, translating into action and policy. That didn't happen. So I think we need to do that more. This is the EOHSI, which I'm sure a lot of y'all's funding comes from, their strategic plan for 2018 to 2023, so have another year before they change it again. But their second pillar here is promoting translation data to knowledge to action, which I'm sure is something that y'all have heard of a lot. What kind of happened in Imperial Valley, and I think happens a lot, is it becomes data to knowledge to dissemination. So what I think we really need to start thinking about is how do we fill this gap and shift from just dissemination of data and knowledge into action? How do we take that next step into making an impact on the communities that are impacted? So I'm proposing that comes from intervention and implementation science. This is a short definition of intervention science, which is changes to structures, processes, or mechanisms in a person's environment in order to achieve improved health. Implementation science is taking that intervention and promoting the adoption and integration of evidence-based practices and policies in order to improve and impact health. So kind of pulling these two together, what my goal is with environmental health research is to design, manage, and promote effective uptake of evidence-based solutions to promote healthy, resilient, and climate-adapted communities. Imperial Valley was severely impacted by climate change, but that's communities across the United States, from the West Coast where I've been to the East Coast where you are now, are going to be continually impacted by climate change. So how can we think about these interventions that we're coming up with in our labs and move them into something that is actually going to help communities be better prepared and be better adapted? So how does this fit into environmental health? People are already doing this, which is great. Implementation science as a subject, people are publishing this and thinking about clean cooking, specific to implementation science, water sanitation programs, and it's actually becoming kind of an emphasis area for EOHSI, which is really exciting thinking about future research. So, where does implementation science fit on this spectrum? And I'm hoping through the rest of my presentation, I'm going to convince you that it fits everywhere along the spectrum. So, just be prepared, a lot of words are about to pop up on this slide, so I'm going to walk you through it step by step. This is kind of a framework that I have put together for combining implementation science and environmental health science with community-based participatory research. So the first thing we have to start with is to build and sustain relationships with communities. So we did this with Imperial Valley. I have tried to do this in Washington, have gotten really to know the communities that I'm working with in Washington. And if I were to come here, you have to start and build relationships, sustain those relationships with the communities that are impacted with your work. The second part is to identify a challenge or a question with community input. So while we want community input in all parts of this framework, this is incredibly important in this step here, because if you're asking a question that the community isn't interested in or isn't going to actually impact the community, there's no point in doing the research with them, right? You want to be making sure that you are doing research that's going to impact, the community wants to know the answer to, even if the answer isn't what they want to hear, that they want the answer. So measure, describe, exposure. This is something a lot of us are doing already, right? What is the environmental exposure? What is the amount of air pollution, the amount of pesticides, the amount of water contamination? And we all kind of do this from different disciplines, right? So you can do this as toxicologists, epidemiologists, exposure scientists, occupational health and public health. In order to move to this next step, which is developing evidence-based interventions, we need all these different disciplines to come in and create these interventions, right? Come up with the evidence that will create the intervention. And then we move into implementation, right? So we take the evidence that as toxicologists, we now have evidence to X, create the intervention to help with that, move into implementation of this intervention, which from here, there is a framework called the REAIM framework, which is reach, effectiveness, adoption, and maintenance, which reach is who. So who are we trying to reach? Who is this implementation actually going to affect? Effectiveness is what? What is the intervention? What are we trying to do? Adoption is where, right? Where are we? What community are we working with? And then implementation is how. How are we being effective in this intervention? And then maintenance is when. Are we actually keeping up with the intervention? Is it something that is sustained within the community? And you notice there's arrows that go back and forth, right? So once we're learning about is this actually being sustained, if it's not, you have to go back up to implementation, or we need to start doing this a different way, right? And you go back around the circle. And then this last step, which is another very important step, is evaluation, which lots of back and forth arrows in here, right? So you need to evaluate, is your implementation working? Is it being sustained? And then this part with building and sustaining relationships with communities, right? You're not going to be able to evaluate if something's working in a community if you don't have that sustained relationship with them. And all of this kind of comes in and ties in with EJ communities, with environmental justice and health equity. In order to promote health equity and to work with communities that are more impacted by air pollution or by climate than others, we have to touch all of these pieces, right? So it's all centered on environmental justice and health equity. So I'm going to jump into my second project, which is now what I'm working on now at University of Washington. It's looking at wildfire smoke exposure in Okanogan County. This was the result of one of two pilot projects that I wrote and was funded for at the UW. This particular one was the Population Health Institute that funded this pilot. And it started as part of this larger project. So SNAP is a funding mechanism, Science for Nature and People Partnerships. And it's intentionally interdisciplinary. They ask a big question and then bring in all of these different experts from different disciplines to answer the question. And so our SNAP working group included people from across the western United States, so up in British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. And we were working on the question of how do we integrate public health and health equity into forest and fire management, which meant that we had ecologists, we had air quality managers, we had public health professionals, occupational health professionals, all in the room kind of thinking about what are all the different angles that we look at wildfire and prescribed fire from. We just posted and published our paper 3 days ago, so you should go and read this paper. I'm very excited about it at the moment. So from that larger working group, One of the things that we found was that we really need more effective risk communication in smoke-impacted communities. Smoke was what brought all the different disciplines together, right? We can think about fire management itself. Fire management affects smoke management, right? The public health professionals and the air quality professionals were all thinking about the smoke side of fire. And so when we got in the room, we kind of had to start with that. What's the common ground? And smoke is what it was. And so the pilot project was funded by the Population Health Initiative, and we focused in this region of Washington, which is in north central Washington here, called the Okanagan River Valley. This area is incredibly rural. It's right at the WUI, the wildland-urban interface, so lots of space for wildfires to happen. Lots of wildfires do happen, but it's also a valley, so fires that happen in Canada, the smoke funnels down. Fires that happen in California and Oregon, the smoke funnels up. And this area is pretty much socked in with smoke from June through September. So we created this partnership with the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, their Natural Resources Department, and the Okanagan River Airshed Partnership. ORAP was a collaborative group of several different community-based organizations in the area. This map, the black outline, is the Colville Reservation. It's the largest reservation in the state of California, and Washington. And Okanagan County itself is the largest county in Washington. This is the area burned over the last 20 years. This is approximately 700,000 acres that you see in the orange here. 145 of those acres happened in 2021, so that was a pretty bad year for the area. And this is just a graph to show you about the air quality in Okanagan County. There's one EPA-regulated monitor in the entire county in the city of Omak. So this is data from the Omak monitor. From some analysis of this data, we showed that in 2021, 40% of the days were either in unhealthy air or higher, which is not a great place to be sitting. So the goal of this project was to really engage with community members in order to understand how they were thinking about smoke and to come up with potential strategies for reducing the impacts of smoke. And then said a little more succinctly, we're going to identify gaps and opportunities, guide smoke risk communication, and then also develop recommendations for other rural and tribal communities that are heavily impacted by smoke. So how did we do this? We did 17 interviews with community agencies and leaders. We identified these leaders through our community partners. So we wrote down all the different areas of people. So we want someone that works in agriculture, we want someone that works in healthcare, and then our community partners picked out those people. These are people that really stand out in the community. We did interviews with those people, and then we did focus groups as well, where we brought together a group of youth or a group of elders, and we split between tribal and non-tribal as much as we could so we could do that comparison there, and talked about how they think about smoke and what types of interventions they're using already or would like to see in the future. And then from these transcripts, we did a thematic analysis of the transcripts in order to understand what themes came up. So I'm going to share a couple of quotes from either the focus groups or the interviews with y'all just to kind of set the stage a bit. And obviously because they're quotes, I'm just going to read them word for word. It's not that we don't think smoke is a bad thing, but I just feel like if it's between saving your home and staying near the smoky area, or not saving your home and staying away from the smoke, most people would choose to risk their health and try to save their property. It's tough because a lot of folks don't have air conditioning necessarily, so the standard way you cool your house down is to open the windows at night. And then of course, if it's smoky, you're going to infuse your house with smoke too. And the last one thing about this community is that they want to know the person that's providing the information, and that's one of the reasons why they trust the incident management teams. We have a tribal member working with these teams so that people will be more trusting about what is said and what is going on out there. So we took these quotes, we took these transcripts and themes and developed a set of 6 recommendations that we are currently working with our community partners to put back out into the community. How are we going to take what we learned from this and share it back out? So the first one is to clarify what is known about the health effects of the smoke. People that we talked to had a general understanding, but there was also this kind of sense of, well, we don't really know. People don't really know how smoke affects your health, and we know that. We know how air pollution affects your health. We've been studying air pollution for a really long time. Smoke is another version of air pollution, right? So we can make inferences here that can help people manage their health. Second one is to define actions that people can take to mitigate the health impacts of smoke. So this is personal interventions or institutional interventions. We need some step-by-step actions for people. We need more coordination between local groups to ensure accuracy, consistency, and reach of this communication. There's a lot of different people working on this and community organizations that are doing a great job, but they're not talking to each other, and there could be so much more shared if there was more intercommunication. We need to emphasize that one's health and the health of one's community is central to wildfire resilience. There's a lot of talk about, I'm okay, I'm a healthy person, I don't need to think about that. But people were very concerned about the elders in their community or the children in their community. So thinking about this concept of kind of one health for the community so we can start to kind of think about what the next steps are was necessary. Emphasize smoke readiness and preparation. That seems kind of self-explanatory, but once fire season goes away, people stop thinking about fire. And so kind of instilling this, we need to start thinking about it before it starts, is something that we think will be really helpful. And then, obviously, addressing and mitigating increasingly frequent and severe wildfires. So that is with forest management, which needs to be improved in general. So, how does this fit into this framework that I already presented? So this is kind of the smoke risk communication version of this. So the community that we started with was in the Okanagan River. We built on existing relationships. So 2 of my mentors were already working with someone at ORAP. Another mentor was working with someone at the Confederated Tribes already. So we built on these existing relationships in order to really make this project better. The question that we asked was increasingly poor air quality from wildfire smoke and lack of community preparedness. So this is what we were seeing. This is the problem that we identified in the community. So how we described the exposure, so notice I have measure and describe exposure. This was really more of a description of the exposure. We did the interviews and focus groups with community members. That's how we were learning about their exposure. The disciplines that really went into this one were population health scientists, public health scientists, and then risk communication. And the evidence-based interventions that we came up with were these recommendations that I just talked you through. And this is kind of where we are now. It's in between this coming up with the interventions and the implementing of these interventions. And if you remember what some of the recommendations are, we're talking about increasing education around the health effects of wildfire smoke. We wouldn't know how to do that education if we didn't have the background from toxicology and from exposure scientists. So we need the evidence-based information from toxicology, from exposure, in order to improve the evidence that we got from these interviews and come all together in that intervention. The implementation part of this, our interview guide and our focus group guides are really built around the reading framework. So we already kind of put in the reach, effectiveness, adoption, maintenance. We built that into our interview guide so that it is consistent throughout the entire project. And then for our continued input and our evaluation, we already have something on the calendar to present this data and to discuss this data with the community leaders down the road. So there's an annual meeting for this cooperative of CBOs, and we have a slot on the docket to talk through this data with everybody and talk about how our interventions actually made a difference in your community. So this project, as I'm sure you all saw, moved me way over to the other end of the spectrum. It was mostly a community-based participatory research project with the evidence-based solutions coming in from toxicology, the questions coming in from exposure, but the methods itself are mostly CPPR methods. So where I'm going now, I'd like to move just slightly closer to the exposure side of things. So I really found myself at this nexus of climate and health in the environment, and it kind of has me asking, who are the communities that are most impacted by climate change? And obviously, it's communities across the country, as I had talked about earlier. So I've been doing wildfire smoke exposure as kind of my into climate change, but climate impacts everybody, right? It's not just wildfires. And so this is a figure from the European Heart Journal that I really like that kind of shows some different ways that climate change can impact air pollution, impact our respiratory health. So wildfire smoke is obviously down here at the bottom. We also have increased ground level ozone, increased particulate matter, heat waves, which, as you remember from one of the quotes, if it gets really hot, people are going to be opening their windows, more air pollution comes in if you don't have access to air conditioning. So this has got me thinking about how this all fits into an EJ lens. This is a definition from the Washington HEAL Act, which stands for Healthy Environment for All. And it says, along with giving equal access, environmental justice includes addressing disproportionate health impacts in laws, rules, and policies with environmental impacts by prioritizing vulnerable populations and overburdened communities with equitable distribution of resources and benefits and eliminating harm. And so who are these vulnerable communities and these overburdened communities? And this is one of the ways to think about it, right? So as toxicologists, and which calling myself a toxicologist here, I usually think more in this exposure sensitivity box, right? So the people that have pre-existing health conditions or elderly people or young people are most impacted by exposure to pollutants. But there's also this second kind of tier, which has come in a lot in my current research, of adaptive capacity. So you have exposure sensitivity. How are they going to be impacted by exposure? How can they adapt to that? How can a population adapt to that exposure as well? And that comes in these different categories of wealth. Can you afford an air conditioning unit? Can you afford an air cleaner? Not everybody can, and not all communities have access to that. Education, do you have the information you need to know what the health impacts of exposure are? Housing, is your house sealed? Is it tight? Is your school sealed and airtight? Or do you have the resources necessary to come into clean air? And all of this goes into what the risk of air pollution is going to be. So we're all impacted by air pollution. We know that from where we live in different parts of the country. But not everyone is affected equally, and I think as we're building those relationships with communities, we have to think about and start with the communities that are impacted that are overburdened. So, kind of an example of this, I mentioned this offhandedly earlier, but Okanagan County, which is highlighted here, only has one EPA-regulated monitor, right? This is the largest county in the state of Washington, and there's only one air monitor that is regulated by the EPA for the entire county. It's up there in Omak, which is admittedly the center of the valley, and so that's where a lot of the smoke and air pollution is, and a lot of this is rural as well. Luckily, the community has kind of adapted. This is a map of the purple air monitor, so community has built their own monitoring system. But if you can see kind of in the far left over here, that kind of hub of purple air monitors, that's the Methow Valley, which is one valley over from Okanagan. It's much more well off than Okanagan County and has a really wonderful CBO that is their community-based organization that is working really hard to increase their community-based monitoring. And so you can see kind of the unequal distribution of access, but also that the community is doing a good job to try to educate and inform themselves on air pollution. So we can do this across the world, right? So I'm doing it in Washington, there's people here doing it in New Jersey. I'm also involved in a project in Guatemala City. I recently became an Air Quality Capacity Building Fellow, which is a partnership between the Research Triangle Institute and the U.S. Department of State. It is a partnership with an air pollution expert and a local government. So I'm working with Guatemala City, which within all the government in Guatemala, there's a single person working on climate-related issues. Her name's Ana, and she is very motivated, but she's the only person in all of Guatemala that is working on this. And so what we're doing is we're trying to build a community network of air monitors. We had an organization send down a single monitor that we're going to start with. She's never worked with a low-cost monitor before, and so I'm hoping, COVID depending, I'll be able to go down and travel there as well. But this type of research, so improving access to air pollution data, improving education around communities, it's not just on the West Coast, it's not just on the East Coast. You can do it, obviously, as you all know, around the world, but I'm doing it around the world as well. So, this is my future project. This is what I proposed for my K99R00, which I recently got the scores back and are promising, but I don't know if it will be funded yet. We'll see. The point of this project was really to kind of combine all these things that I have been talking about. So, exposure science, YPAR, youth participatory action research, and implementation science. And the goal of this project was to create school-based air monitoring networks. And the thinking behind this is to think about schools as a common ground among students, right? So I mentioned the high school that I worked with in Imperial Valley, which got me very excited about working with youth, and working with youth as kind of a boundary broker between research and communities. And so when I was in Imperial Valley, when I mentioned that we all presented to the community afterwards, myself and the students, the community members were way more receptive to hearing from the students than they were from me. And I've gotten pretty good at science communication, but the students themselves, there was a sense of pride that came with hearing from their own youth that really made an impact. And so that's one of the things that I have grounded the ideas for this project in. Is the idea is to, which I'll go through this in the framework of course, but is to have schools become a clean air space. Homes for students, it's kind of runs the gamut, right? You might have homes that are very new and protected versus very old homes that will be more susceptible to air pollution, but all students are coming to school. They spend a lot of time in school, and so would it be possible to make schools a clean air space to improve air quality for at least a chunk of the day for kids? This is being done sort of in a program in Denver called Love My Air. They've established a school-based monitoring program across the Denver County, which is really a collaboration for them between the school nurses and the students. They have created these monitors, so monitors that display monitoring data that the students can see when they walk into the school, and then they have workshops with the school nurse to talk about the different health impacts of what the air quality happens to be that day. So with my project, how this is going to work is, so YPAR school-based monitoring version of this. I have created relationships with 2 different high schools in Washington State. One is in Okanagan County in that same region, and one really close to Seattle, and have started to build closer and closer relationships with these 2 high school teachers. The problem or the challenge is there's increasingly poor air quality from climate-related sources, not just wildfires, but others as well. So the measuring is a YPAR air monitoring project. So the students themselves are actually going to be designing the project. So I have a curriculum that they will be going through to learn about air pollution and the health impacts of air quality. But, and then they will get access to a different variety of sensors, and then they get to decide where are we going to place these sensors, what are we going to measure, for how long. So the disciplines that go into this, obviously exposure science, YPAR, citizen science, and then again, risk communication. So the intervention here is this air quality curriculum that I mentioned, and then the interventions, part of why this project is exciting is that the students get to come up with the interventions themselves. So like I said, they get to place the monitors, and then the next step of the project is to design interventions based on what they've learned in the curriculum and based on what they have learned from the monitoring itself. So we've already started to create these partnerships between the students, school administrators, the school facilities staff, to start thinking about what are ways that we can improve air quality. At the Denver program, they have instituted an anti-idling program where they have signs that have gone up outside the school that reminds parents to turn off their cars when they came in. The reason that they did that is the students were monitoring, and they found out that there's a peak in air quality outside of this, or peak in air pollution outside of the schools when pickup time and drop-off time. And so this is what their intervention was that they have implemented. Again, for implementation, each stage of it is going to be driven by the students. So we're really thinking about who, the students themselves, the effectiveness is coming from what they've learned in the monitoring, adoption is a school community, and then the maintenance and the evaluation, we were building in these air quality lessons into the health curriculum for the schools. So there's a workshop that happens annually through the University of Washington that the teachers have been invited to, where they're learning to build this this and other climate-related issues into their curriculum. So it'll be something that even after the tenure of my K, will still remain at the school. And one of the goals is to have this monitoring system be something that remains as well, so there'll be continuous monitoring in the schools. So, hopefully, I have given you a lot to think about, and I have a question for you, is that within environmental health science, which discipline, I think in this room we all come from slightly different disciplines and online as well, which discipline do you think should take on implementation science? And I actually have a poll. So, you can go to the poll and I want to see what thoughts y'all come up with. So you can do it on your phone or wherever. It's pollev.com/sdevlin884. And if you put a space, it breaks up the words, as you see that happen with public health. So if you put a dash or a period, hopefully it just misspell it, that's fine. And as you all put those in, we'll see kind of what disciplines pop up. Maybe a few minutes. It is working on someone's phone.
Can I have some photos?
It works.
Okay, good. Exposure science, I think that's public health, or maybe just health. Public health, public health. Exposure science, public health. Toxicology. Policymakers, yeah. So health is the big, public health is the big one's coming up. Toxicology. Policy science. All of them. That's the answer I was looking for. I'm going to put that. Policy science. Exposure science. Great. Okay. So, lots of different disciplines coming up here. So I have kind of situated myself here at this kind of nexus of exposure and CPPR with that toxicology spectrum still obviously coming into the questions I ask. But an interdisciplinary crisis like climate change and how it impacts our air needs an interdisciplinary solution, right? So we really need people across the spectrum to be doing implementation science, to be moving into communities, and hopefully I have convinced you of that throughout this presentation. Okay, so I just want to thank, obviously all of my mentors are listed there on the left, and then the different funding agencies that I have gone through at UW over the past couple of years. And yeah, thank you so much. Any questions?
So first we'll take questions from the room. Howard?
Sure. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. I have two questions.
Yeah.
Have you thought about, or maybe you have done, or maybe this is a bad idea, applying health outcomes like changes in respiratory function, inflammation, to the education part of with the kids?
Yes.
As part of the process?
Absolutely. So that's part of my K99 is that into the curriculum itself, there's various health outcomes that the students are learning about within the curriculum, and then I'm hoping we're going to encourage this, that will be part of their implementation that they think about as they're coming up with their implementation plan as well, is to measure either doing like a small spirometry experiment or something that can actually be measured within the high school. But yes, it is, the health outcomes are built into that air quality curriculum that I talked about.
And then sort of related, I noticed you had Catherine Carr on there as a collaborator. Catherine, I believe, has measured respiratory function in asthmatic kids exposed to dairy CAFOs.
Yeah.
So it seems like what you do, part of what you do here is you're creating cohorts, if you will, of exposed people have you, in sort of a cross-disciplinary or team science way, have people been able to leverage the communities that you've engaged into actual not actual, but into research, into health-based research?
Yeah, so that relationship that I built with the community in Okanagan County, I got a second pilot project funded through Panache, through the Ag Center at UW, where we're looking at exposure in farm workers. And the first part is again kind of the interviews, but the goal is to then actually be measuring exposure in farm worker kids and to understand what the level of exposure are for their families. And so we'll be doing some health outcomes specifically with that study, and that relationship that I built with Okanagan County is from that. So we're able to do this study because of that community that we created with UW.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great talk. Is there plans within any of these studies to communicate the science and advocate for policy changes, like specifically to policymakers?
Yeah, absolutely. So that larger SNAP project that I talked about, there's 3 different work streams, and one of them is specifically a policy work stream. And so there's, within that large group of collaborators, we have people from Washington Labor and Industries and other policymaking groups that we're already working together to think about, okay, what are the next steps that we can actually, in a policy sense, integrate public health into how we manage fire smoke. Yes, it's happening.
Go ahead.
Okay. So my assumption is that because of a lot of cultural differences, it might be hard to form those relationships and have trust in a lot of these communities. So I was wondering what you think is the best way to approach those issues when they occur, especially if you, let's say, don't have those pre-existing relationships that you had with your past studies.
Yeah, it's really hard, honestly. And so, especially kind of moving, so I had to do this moving from California to Washington, kind of starting fresh. I got to know the communities in California, especially in Imperial, really well. And so, kind of as a starting point in Washington, I did start with people that UW already knew, right? That my mentors at UW already knew. And then it was through those community members that I formed my own partnership. So you kind of have to find those people that are kind of the nexus points to other communities. And something that we learned from that Okanagan smoke study was that it is incredibly important to hear information from people that you trust. And you can't assume that you know who the trusted members of the community are, right? Like we, going into that project, really thought that people working at DNR who do fire management, so the Department of Natural Resources, that would be very trusted. They're authority figures. They do educational outreach with the community, and we very strongly learned that people do not trust them. And so kind of having that, kind of checking yourself on those assumptions, I think is really important. And also going in with the knowledge that you want to learn as much from the community, if not more, than they are learning from you. And so, yeah, I think that those are all important things to think about when you're going into a new community.
Ken?
You know, just kind of a minor thing. It seems like, take your high school intervention, your high school program, how closely correlated that with the health training? I mean, I can think of all of this pulmonary stuff really good. They start smoking. It seems to me that that would overwhelm any other factor of respiratory issue except maybe exhaust. You know, how do you control for that? What kind of cofactor controls do you have?
Yeah, so that's really hard. So that's something that we're hoping to build into the air quality curriculum itself, right? So right now, the project as a whole is kind of focused on environmental outdoor air pollution, right? But through that summer project that I talked about with different exposures, that's through the EDGE Center at UW, the teachers learn different types of exposures each year. So we actually did a vaping study a couple of years ago. This year it's wildfire smoke, and next year I think it's traffic-related air pollution. And so making sure that we're not just focusing on a single thing, right? So within the education piece of it yourself, you have to build in those covariates. And so, yeah, hopefully that kind of answer your question, making sure that you
Kind of. I mean, it just seems to me that, you know, you're legalizing marijuana in all the states. Kids are starting to pick up smoking more aggressively now. You know, the smoking cessation programs have been, you know, ambiguous, and yet you're looking at environmental